Hello and welcome to the Honest Not Perfect podcast. My name is Suzanne Ellingham and I'm the director of Source Events, the platform that helps connect retailers, brands and wholesalers to manufacturers and makers globally.
And my name is Jack Stratton. I'm director of Insider Trends. We are a global retail trend spotting agency helping brands to spot what's coming next.
Hi and welcome to this episode of Honest Not Perfect. We have an amazing guest this episode, joining myself and Jack in the studio, and someone whose work we've actually long admired at Source Fashion, which is Safia Minney. For those of you listening who haven't had the chance to meet or learn about Safia and the work that she does, she is responsible and regarded as a pioneer of developing the first sustainable and fair trade supply chains and processes. She's a recognised expert in sustainable fashion and exceptionally knowledgeable across the board when it comes to issues around sustainability and modern slavery. She's authored many books, documentaries, films around fair trade and sustainability, and she's received an MBE for services to fair trade and the fashion industries. I think one of the things that's most interesting about working with Safia and listening to some of the work that she's done is she has developed these processes for fair trade and social enterprises in Asia, Africa, Latin America. She's started programs that allow sustainable fair trade management systems to thrive. For the World Trade Organization, she was also the first company to achieve a fair trade certification level for operations internationally. In 2010, she launched People Tree Europe in London, and in early 2022, she led the launch of Fashion Declares, which is a bottom-up industry-wide movement to promote radical action in climate, ecology and social emergency. More recently, and we'll talk to this, we have a new project called Indolisi, which is all around pioneering artisanal fashion, but we're absolutely going to come back to that. But Safia, that's quite a journey. And I think from knowing a little bit about the work you do and listening to you speak over the years, I'm really curious, how did you fall into this world? How did you fall into this role? What, some people say, I'm going to do this. It's like, I feel like you genuinely changed the lives and the working processes of so many people around the world who service fashion. What was your entry into this world, or what was your moment where you thought, actually, we can make a change here and do things better?
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to join the podcast, Suze, and for the introduction. So I suppose, my background, I was working at Creative Review magazine, so I was part of the advertising industry for about 4 years. I started work at the age of 17, and it was very near Carnaby Street, so I would go into the local Oxfam store. There were amazing leftover products from the beautiful stores around, people who would, secondhand and thrift their garments in those stores. And alongside them were also really, really bad examples of fair trade coffee and tea, because at the time, we're talking 40 years ago now, they weren't very good. But I would sample them, lots of books on development issues, on international finance, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where I first kind of started to, I guess, become aware that the current neoliberalist economic system wasn't working. There I was with both feet in the advertising industry, watching huge budgets being spent on brand building, advertising stuff that didn't make you feel happier or weller or necessarily considered in the least, people who made those products or the earth from which those products were derived. So I think for me it was, just very, very slowly. I was studying economics at A-level at the time at night school, and also kind of running a little business, but in a rented desk kind of round the corner. But I was very drawn to a system that clearly wasn't working.
And I think a lot of people may be in that situation now where they see something that's not working, but I think there's a difference between those people who see a system's not working and just think, well, only one person, what can I do to anything about that? Like, it's too much of a problem, too big of a problem to challenge or change. What were your steps in actually moving from seeing something to going out and actually trying to improve processes or improve things? Because I think that's a very different mentality, and it is a little bit different to the majority of people who will look at a system and think, well, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd had this lovely experience working in publishing where I'd led a little team. It was, we got other publications, and it was really multi-ethnic, which at the time in the 80s was really unusual. And so at the age of 22, I went off travelling, as a lot of people did. Had they've gone to university, which I hadn't. But and I realised that the narrative that we'd been sold of, the developing world and, oh, poor them, and, they really need this kind of capitalist fix, that actually that was rubbish. And that in fact, the Western corporations and organisations were often undermining, the fisher folk, the small-scale farmers, the local businesses of the countries that I travelled through. My father is Indian Mauritian, although he's a scientist. He died when I was a child, but so I visited his country, and then I then travelled through Southeast Asia, and so that really brought it home to me that actually, we were often being sold a narrative that actually wasn't true. And so when I came back, I then started working with what we call at that point alternative publications, so New Society, New Statesman, some ethnic minority titles, Spare Rib, a number of other kind of feminist and arts titles. And then after a few years of that, I got married, went to Japan. My husband at the time was British, but he was working in Japan. So I thought, to be honest, I kind of went also because I was fed up with Thatcher and Reaganism. I was just like, oh, God, I'm fed up.
Oh, but Japan is beautiful as well. There are worse places to go.
I know, it's amazing. But yes, and I there I was in Roppongi, and I kind of had this life, and I was studying intensive Japanese, like 5 hours a day, teaching English at an academy, which was really interesting because lots of people were Japanese people are just wonderful. They're so curious and they're intelligent, and they're not kind of closed. Like if you say that you're vegetarian, they don't go, oh, you must be mad. They go, oh, why are you vegetarian? Oh, and you explain, that grain through, cows and creating meat is actually a really inefficient way, and therefore there's a human rights issue there as well as, a resource issue, an environmental issue. But they're very open-minded, and that was really great. So then there I was in Japan in the early 90s. People were throwing out like stereos and electronics that were, 18 months old and relatively new things. And I just, I was like, my God, if everyone consumes like this, like the Japanese, like the British, we won't have a world left. And I think that's really what got me on the journey. So I started Global Village, which is a citizens group, and we published lots of information about where to buy organic food and recycle and to become active as kind of active citizens. And then from that, I grew this little fair trading company, which grew into People Tree. And I suppose, clothing and fashion, to be honest, the company that I set up in Japan was selling organic and fair trade food. Coffee, chocolate, tea, lots of dried fruits and that kind of thing, working very, very closely with the farming groups, sometimes helping to sponsor their going to organic so that we'd have that reassurance for customers in Japan. And then, being at the time a young woman, I just thought, oh, God, I'd love to wear clothing. It was the beginning of those sweatshop scandals, in the early 90s, with, lots of the streetwear and fashion and denim brands. And I thought, God, wouldn't it be amazing to design product made out of 100% organic cotton using craft skills, hand weaving, hand embroidery, with fair trade organisations, a product that, Japanese people might buy. So that's really, I guess, how I started the journey. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
Right. No, but what I'm curious about is how easy or how difficult it was about uncovering those great makers and farmers, because when we look at this through a European lens, when we speak to retailers, one of the biggest things they say, we don't know who's good to work with, or how do we trust the people that we're working with that this is what's happening. And I think as you started out on that journey, however long ago it was, what were your first steps? Did you find it more difficult to find the people, or did you actually find it really easy once you knew exactly what you wanted and the standards that you wanted within your brand, within your business?
Well, it was 35 years ago, so it was very difficult because it didn't really exist. And so I went to Zimbabwe, and the only organic cotton was produced by black farmers, but the mills were owned by white farmers, and they certainly didn't want to gin the organic cotton separately from their own. There was no benefit for the rich. Yeah. So that was very disappointing. And then in India, I remember working with this kind of really hippie community who sold me some nice organic cotton. God knows where that ended up. It didn't turn up. So, there were lots of false starts. And then I went into Yavatmal in central India, and there was some really great organic cotton. But then I found that actually the farmers' families were very poor, living in mud huts, distended bellies, so clearly they were not being paid properly. The children were malnourished. So then I realised that we really had to have fair trade together with organic standards. I am talking about 30 years ago. Now, if you got certified organic cotton with fair trade certification, you've got the best social standards, you've got the best environmental standards. And of course, many of those pioneering farming groups, I then worked with RDFC, Agricel, which some of the farming organisations now with RDFC, who I visited when I did part of my research on regenerative fashion futures. We made a lovely film about it, so it would be nice if we could link it in.
A silly question. RDFC, what does that stand for?
Oh, gosh, I knew you were going to ask that. RDF.
Don't worry, we'll put it...
Rapa and Gadandra. It's in Gujarat, but okay. Yes, I'd love to put it in there. But in answer to your question, this is the great thing about industry collaboration, because you can, if you're sincere, you can get information about how to buy, where to buy. You can work with other buyers to bulk buy. Sometimes, yes, it means changing your critical path. I know that when we first set up the supply chains, we give commitment to farmers 18 months before we moved that cotton into through the different tiers and into CMT. So, But that's, part of the fun of it is meeting the farmers, eating with them, staying next to their village. I've slept in dormitories of factories before, but it's really understanding the workers, the producers in the supply chain, whether they be farmers or factory workers.
And obviously, when I'm going to let you ask a question.
No, I've got that. I can tell we're both just queuing up with questions.
Yeah, I'll let you go next.
Yeah, I'll jump in with one. What's immediately kind of apparent from how you talk about this is it's quite a rare thing with you, Safia, where you have, because you're still very much in this world doing the same kind of work, because you're constantly trying to, keep solving this impossible problem. How different has that experience been? It's fascinating when you describe when you started this, the beginning of your journey, and the beginning of your fair trade journey, for example. I'm just thinking of a political time of Thatcher or post-Thatcher. But also, I remember, as a kid, sustainability, if I think about it from the retail side, what was it? It was Body Shop and some second-hand shops. No one talked about it. It wasn't part of the culture. And suddenly now we're at a time where I was talking to someone about this recently, but the sustainability has been so talked about. I'm not saying that it's been talked about well, or that it's, that we've got always that much closer to doing anything about it. But in terms of being a cultural idea, we now talk about it so much that I feel like a lot of people are bored of it. We've almost gone the other way. How different is that experience now, as you come into your next venture? I think that's what's so interesting, is you have a direct comparison about kind of trying to change systems within this 30 years, where I feel like the public perception of this issue is completely different. You've gone from people knowing, kind of not really even talking about it, to now talking about it so much that it's just one of those things that floats around. Fair trade is just a thing we see on a banana and we don't even think about what that means. So how is, from your experience,